Within the month of February, there were several games coming out that you couldn't really ignore. The big ones people were probably waiting for was Persona 3 Reload, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and maybe Helldivers 2. But there were still some smaller releases that came by too, more specifically a handful of indie games. And while a few games caught my interest, I was sure to make time for one game in particular, and that was Penny's Big Breakaway. But I think this requires a bit of background, so let me give some context. Back in 2017, Sonic Mania was released to critical acclaim. It was the series' best received game in years, and even now, is still the best rated title in recent memory. And no, this doesn't count. But what made Sonic Mania so significant was the developers behind it, Christian Whitehead, Headcanon, and Pagoda West Games. These were devs who were dedicated fans of Sonic, even making their own fan games and ROM hacks in the past. And when they had a chance to make their own official game, they ended up making one of the highest rated titles of the franchise ever. And after the great success of Mania, you'd think that a sequel would be a no-brainer. I'm pretty sure the devs were open to work on another title too, but no news of a sequel ever came up. So instead, the development team went on to form their own studio named Evening Star. Behind the scenes, they'd work on their own project for a few years, and eventually revealed their game in a Nintendo Direct, called Penny's Big Breakaway. And with the reputation of the devs and the game looking legitimately great, it was another indie game I kept on my wishlist. And the updates were kinda sparse, but once the release window drew near, they began showing a bit more of the game. And then out of nowhere, Shadow dropped the game during February's Nintendo Direct. Honestly, that caught me by surprise, but I was no less excited to finally give the game a try. So with all that in mind, let's get into the game proper. So we follow Penny, who's looking to participate in a popular audition to get a chance at performing alongside the Big Emperor Eddie. On her way there, she picks up a cosmic string, turning her yo-yo sentient and giving her some new tricks. But during the audition, the yo-yo takes a slash at Emperor Eddie, causing an embarrassing accident which ends up putting a big target on Penny's head, leaving her to make a break for it. And from there, the story kinda lingers throughout the game, having Penny travel across the world of Macaroon for several reasons. Obviously, the main one is to avoid being captured by the millions of penguins sent her way, but you'll also learn a bit more about the cosmic string of her yo-yo, Emperor Eddie's backstory and performing partner Taboo, and how Penny can possibly clear her name. Honestly, I'm surprised how much dialogue is used for the game's story, or how they even use dialogue to begin with. Given the game's trailers and opening, I assumed the game would be a show-don't-tell sort of deal with its simple premise. But given each character's personalities and the depth that the story has, it might have been too difficult to explain the plot without any text, not to mention all the NPCs who have their own clips and chats. It works well enough, but it just caught me by surprise really. What kinda puts me off is the presentation for all the story scenes. All cutscenes are either animated in 2D or use in-game graphics instead, and I honestly wish they just stuck with one style instead of switching between the two. It just makes the in-game cutscenes look cheaper when the 2D ones have more detail and movement in comparison. And I'd like to think that this might have been a stylistic reason, like how older 3D mascot platformers had their fair share of in-game cutscenes. But even then, it feels like a half-hearted approach when the 2D animated cutscenes just outshine the in-game ones for me. Not that it matters much, since there's only a handful of cutscenes to see and the presentation for them isn't exactly the important part. Thankfully, the rest of the game does just fine with its visuals. There's plenty of colorful environments and vibrant animations to see throughout the game, and it gives the game a fun, cartoony art style that my eyes can't get enough of. It's impressive how detailed each area is despite the simple shapes of some objects and the equally simple texture work. I love how there's a soft, hazy look for the game's depth of field, kinda similar to a painterly style, I think. It's a unique effect I haven't really seen in any other game, and it just adds to the game's visual design. Although turning it off looks a lot cleaner, and I'm glad they give you that option through an update. Characters are all full of lively animations too, but the clear highlight is Penny herself. And that's pretty obvious given that she wields a yo-yo all the time, but it's not just the countless yo-yo tricks either. Penny herself is fairly expressive and has a lot of squash and stretch to her movements. The busker animations are a good example of that. There's even a little window to show off her expressions in-game. Nice detail there. Bosses and NPCs also have similar exaggeration, but bosses get too little screen time to leave any lasting impressions. Still, the effort is apparent and appreciated. There are a few problems though, at least on the technical side of things. For one, the render distance could be a bit better. Even with maxed out settings on PC, there's still a couple times where you can see objects pop in, and it's pretty rare given all the fixed camera angles, but it can still be noticeable at times. And as for the frame rate, there's no real issues I have for the PC version, and the PS5 and Xbox versions can even run the game at 120 frames per second, which I can commend them for implementing. But unfortunately for Switch users, the game mainly runs at a locked 30, which is completely fine, don't get me wrong, but I kinda expected it to run at 60 given the game's simpler visual style. And there has been a patch that allows an unlocked frame rate, but it still doesn't hit a consistent 60, which is honestly a bit baffling. I feel like it would be a lot easier to reach given what the Switch can run, you know? maybe optimizing the game for Switch is more complicated than it seems. I mean, the game uses its own star engine, so maybe that could be why. Or maybe there isn't enough horsepower behind the Switch to reach a stable 60. It wouldn't be the first time for this 7-year-old device. Jesus Christ, it's been 7 years already. Anyways, aside from some minor gripes, I think the game looks pretty stellar for what it tries to accomplish. But it's time I get into the gameplay, and this is what intrigued me the most. How would they implement a character's moves around a yo-yo? I mean, it's pretty rare to see a yo-yo as a primary tool for platformers, and even then, using a yo-yo might be a bit unorthodox. But there's also a lot of potential too, and I'm glad to say that Penny's Big Breakaway does a really good job with its mechanics in that sense. This is something you might be familiar with already. Penny has a handful of moves that work better in different situations and in conjunction with one another, like some 3D Mario games and similar titles. For example, you can roll with your yo-yo to gain some speed down slopes, or you can dash before a roll to give yourself a better startup. A wall jump can give you a bit of height if you need it, but combine that with a yo-yo bounce and a double jump and you'll be able to ascend some bigger walls. It's all about how you use and combine your moves, and this can allow you to get past obstacles more efficiently than you would normally. There's even a built-in combo counter to encourage chaining these moves together. You gotta keep on rolling to maintain your combo, and if you're looking to get some high scores for those extra rewards, you'll need to master the movement and mind your surroundings to get as much points as possible. And speaking of your surroundings, the environment also plays an important role with your abilities, albeit to a lesser degree. Your roll and swing moves actually work directly with the level design. Rolling is mainly a way to gain speed down the slopes, while also granting some height if there's a ramp you can launch off of. In the case that you need to reach a platform high in the air, you might need a ramp and enough speed to get up to it. And as for swinging, that works with how far you fall. So if you find yourself at a high point and want to get to a place far in the distance, you can fall from that high point for a bit and use the swing to redirect your falling speed into a forward launch instead. And I really love how that works. Granted, you won't always have the height to pull off these big swings, but when you do, and you time your swing correctly to launch yourself at just the right angle, making that big jump feels immensely satisfying to clear. Now, it's not like you need to know that about the swing move. In fact, that might be leaning more towards the advanced side of the game's movement, but I couldn't help but mention it because I adore how it's implemented. Using your fall speed and transferring that into a big launch is something I've never really seen before. Unfortunately, the linear design of the game somewhat restricts this kind of movement, but I'm just glad to be able to use it to some degree. In normal gameplay though, the swing basically works as either a double jump or a long jump depending on when you let go of it. But aside from your base movement, you might also need to think about the controls, because this game has two distinct control schemes. There's the simple controls, giving you something more traditional with limited camera movement, and then there's the pro controls, giving you a more practical and unorthodox control scheme. This places your inputs on the bumpers and triggers instead, with your main throwing move on the right stick. And honestly, it's kind of an odd choice to give us an option, because even if you prefer the simple control scheme, it's already implemented into the pro controls, with the only difference being the lack of camera control. But seeing as the camera controls are already pretty restrictive, alongside the game already having fixed camera angles, you won't be missing out on much. Besides, having roll on the trigger and performing spins with the right stick makes the experience just a bit smoother than it would be otherwise. So personally, I'd recommend the pro controls for the best of both worlds, although the simple option is still there if you prefer it. But going back to the game elements, I should probably cover the game's main structure and progression. So the game follows the linear stage-to-stage structure that you're probably familiar with. Each world has a handful of levels to complete and sometimes ends with a boss fight. However, not every world has a boss, which may or may not be a bad thing, but more on that later. Each stage has their own gimmicks and hazards unique to each world, but throughout the game, you'll also use a few power-ups and items to get past certain obstacles. You can ride a motorized yo-yo to roll over hazards, use a large yo-yo to break some objects for a bit, or use a magnet to fly through specific rays. Most of these are fairly situational though, and they either have a time limit or are restricted to a small area. Unfortunately, this also means that they don't really mesh well with your abilities either. It's usually just a way to shake things up a bit. I did enjoy playing with these power-ups, but I just wish they worked more with your own abilities, like the Whirling Wafer for example. The Whirling Wafer whisks you high into the sky and lets you slowly glide to the ground, but there's usually a few platforms that you can land on early, so you can cancel your glide, swing towards the closer platforms, and get to the end of the section faster. This is the only power-up that really allows a different approach with your moveset. Thanks to the height you get, you can use your swings to approach the area in a different way, and I really like how that works. Again, this isn't to undermine the other items, but I feel like the Whirling Wafer here raised the standard just a bit for me. There's also a few optional collectibles that you can seek out for some extra replayability. In each main stage, there's 3 big coins to collect and 3 dilemmas to complete. The big coins just need to be found and collected, but the dilemmas are short tasks that require you to do a variety of things under specific conditions, like collecting items under a time limit, breaking containers within an area, or getting enough points in one combo. Getting big coins allows you to unlock Star Globe stages, while completing dilemmas grants you a bigger point bonus by the end of each stage. And I think these two are both great options for giving players more difficult tasks. Both rewards are also fairly different on how they challenge the player. Collecting big coins for Star Globes mainly focuses on platforming, while completing dilemmas is for earning high scores. It's a nice way to give the player a choice if they prefer playing for one challenge over the other. Although, I feel like going for high scores is way harder than the Star Globes, but I'll get into that later. It's all still optional, so if you're just playing through the game casually or don't really care for that stuff, it's never required to beat the game. By the end of some worlds, you'll also come across one of the few boss fights of the game, but honestly, there's not much to say about them. They're completely fine and play well enough, but they don't leave much of an impression. I can appreciate giving each boss their own unique gimmicks to deal with, and it certainly helps make them stand out. But I seriously almost forgot to mention them while writing the script, and I'm pretty sure that says enough about them. It doesn't help that boss fights don't appear in every world either, so their presence is even smaller compared to the main levels. They aren't unbearable or awful, which is a good thing for sure, but to me, they're just kinda there. To be fair though, platformers aren't exactly known for their boss fights, so it's standard in that sense, but I don't know. They're okay, but that's all I can really say. At least they don't take 10 years to beat like some other game I know. Well, overall, I think the core gameplay of Penny's Big Breakaway is very enjoyable. It's your standard 3D platformer with some unique aspects added onto it that encourages a bit of experimentation, variety, and replayability. But if the base game and all the collectibles still weren't enough for you, there's some more content in the form of Star Globes, Time Attack Mode, and the unlockable scrapbook photos. The Star Globes are the rewards for collecting enough big coins in the main stages. These are bite-sized challenge stages that usually focus on one or two gimmicks, and are usually harder than most of the main stages in the game. But because of their short length, they aren't as difficult as you'd think they'd be. In fact, they can be a bit forgettable because of how short they are. There's not even a reward for completing them all. I guess the Star Globes themselves are the reward for collecting the big coins, but if you're looking for a reward after that, there's nothing here to see. Now, the time attack is nothing new, just get to the end as fast as possible, and I think that works fine for a game like this. There's definitely a bunch of big shortcuts to find, and I've already seen some crazy stuff online, so that checks out. Now this is definitely a nitpick on my end, but I wish you could just restart faster. That sounds really odd, but when you're going for that perfect run and end up restarting a bunch of times because you keep making mistakes, the time taken up from that opening screen starts to add up. So a faster reset would be to drop out instead, since there's no checkpoints and it's generally faster than a menu restart. So if dropping out of a stage can reset faster, why can't menu restarts be just as fast? I just wish there was a way to restart with a press of a button, or at least have the restart be a bit faster or get rid of the opening on time attack runs. Something similar to how Mania did it would be nice. You know, with the... That was basically instant, and it was just an amazingly convenient feature to have. But here, you gotta wait for that opening to play out or look for a pit to fall into. I know that having an instant restart button would basically be impossible, but if a dropout with no checkpoints can reset me so quickly, why can't I have a button for that too, you know? But again, this is just a small nitpick, and most people probably won't care anyways. But if you're not into time attack, you can go for all those scrapbook photos instead. These are basically concept art for the game, and to get these photos, you'll need to earn enough points in a stage and beat it. It sounds simple enough, but in execution, it's almost the exact opposite. To earn a bunch of points, you'll need to do a few things. First, you'll need to perform big combos with your moves and other stage objects, while rolling around to maintain your combos. Think Tony Hawk's Pro Skater or Bomb Rush Cyberpunk to compare it to something. Secondly, you'll also need to complete most or all of the dilemmas in the stage, since they're the main score booster to help you meet those high score requirements. If you skip just one dilemma, you'll miss out on a bunch of points, so they're all basically required for those higher score requirements. And thirdly, you'll need to do most of the stage almost damageless. I say almost because taking damage normally doesn't really matter, but if you have any combo going, you immediately lose that combo and all the points you were building up. You get nothing back. It's not always a run killer, but if you got a big combo over a large portion of the stage and end up taking damage, you might as well reset. If you ever buy the show off spotlight item to help boost your score, that also requires you to beat the stage damageless. And if you somehow end up dying, that gives you a huge score penalty, so there's a lot of factors going against imperfect play. And this might sound pretty doable, but this is a very demanding challenge. You're basically performing big combos all the time, while doing other tasks simultaneously. That means you're dashing, swinging, and rolling repeatedly throughout the entire stage, completing all the dilemmas, and avoiding every hazard to keep your combos going. and if you come across any obstacle that requires you to wait on moving platforms or time your movements right, that can basically force you to end your combo just to move on. And yes, there is a way to get around that problem, but it's very unwieldy to perform. If you swing low enough to hit the ground, you can transition that into a whirl to land on the ground and keep your combo going. But that requires very specific timing and positioning, which just adds to the already demanding challenge. Not to mention, the score requirements get higher and higher for each stage. It starts at 50,000 points, which is fine, but then it goes up to 70,000, 80,000, 90,000, and even 100,000 points for the last main stage. That's exhausting just thinking about it. But despite all the difficulties of going for the scrapbook photos, I think that this is still an excellent challenge for the game, maybe even the best. It requires extreme mastery of the game's mechanics and movement. You need to know where all the dilemmas are, make the most out of every stage object and gimmick, all while performing moves and flashy tricks, which is pretty fitting for Penny's character. You even need to utilize that swing whirl tech to make bigger combos, which was apparently intentional by the dev team. And I might have not done them yet, but I know I'll come back to them at some point because I love the mechanics of the game. It's an exceedingly hard task, but one I can still enjoy completing. Not back to back though. I adore the challenge, but it can be extremely deflating sometimes. Taking damage during a high combo can be really demoralizing, especially if you're almost done with the stage. And if you end up beating a stage but don't meet the requirements, then that's another playthrough of the stage you have to go through. That means doing all those combos, all the dilemmas, and the entire stage again, hoping that you have just enough points this time. There were a handful of times where I just barely missed the score requirements, and I did not want to go through the stage again. God, it's just like the Cuphead boss fights again. This certainly isn't for everyone, that much is clear, but for the select few who really want to take on the hardest test of skill this game has to offer, this is probably what you're looking for. I can respect the challenge and what it can give, but I gotta chip away at it, not marathon it. It's not like I need it for this video anyways. I should mention that the main game itself is a very comfortable ride in terms of difficulty, which is why I focus so much on the harder parts of the game. Like, there might be more bottomless pits than your average platformer, but there are no lives, so it only takes one health point away. And losing all your health still allows you to start from checkpoints, so taking too much damage is almost a non-issue. But if you're going for high scores or speed runs, taking any damage or dropping out is now a bigger punishment, and dying basically forces a reset. But whether or not you're looking for something laid back or something more demanding, Penny's Big Breakaway does a great job in covering all bases in difficulty, and I can admire how they approached it. So far, I've been praising this game a lot, but I'm fully aware that it's far from perfect, and I have my own fair share of issues to bring up. Some were based on the game's mechanics, others were just simple critiques like the cutscene visuals, and a handful were more on the game's stability. For starters, sometimes the camera doesn't allow much room for backtracking. I know that's just how the game's designed, but there's a few moments where you might need to back up to proceed, and that might lead to trouble sometimes. Depth perception can also be an issue from the camera, especially since the game uses more bottomless pits later into the game. And your drop shadow certainly helps, but when you're landing from high up, your shadow might not show unless you get closer to the ground. Also, the camera can just snap sometimes, and I have no idea why. I've already talked about the boss fights, but they also end pretty awkwardly. They either cut right to a result screen, or they teleport everyone to the center, and that's it. And during this section, if you go backwards instead of going forwards, the floor won't follow you and you'll just be standing on nothing. There were also a lot of smaller moments where things felt like they weren't functioning properly. There's a move that allows your yo-yo to ledge grab, but it felt like it only worked half the time and I couldn't tell why, so I never relied on it that much. There's also a few times where Penny just stumbled on a small slope and locked my controls for a bit. For big slopes, that makes sense because she's not meant to run on them, but not for something like this. The same thing happens whenever Penny does this skidding animation. I assume this happens if she's moving too fast on the ground, but sometimes it just happens for no clear reason, and my controls lock up again, causing me to do unintentional things in a panic. There's a lot more small inconsistencies that I ran into, and they weren't game-breaking by any means, but they certainly bogged down the experience a bit. It's part of the reason why I didn't go for all those scrapbook photos. Going for those is already hard enough, but when your run ends because of something like this, it makes it even more unappealing. I did get a laugh out of some things though, namely the glitches. I should reiterate that the game is more than stable and you'll most likely never encounter any bugs on your own, but I certainly ran into a few glitches myself, and sometimes it was ridiculously easy to find them. There were a handful of walls missing collision, like this one on the second stage, and it was just right here. A couple times I swung and clipped into a few objects, getting stuck as a result. The magnet item teleported me, which isn't how it works. I went through a lava fall somehow and caused an awkward camera pan right after. The water waves didn't spawn here, causing me to die to reset it. There was missing collision at this corner here. I got stuck in another object but also got out. and I skipped a hovering section by getting on top of this wall, which isn't exactly a glitch, but it doesn't seem intended, and I just thought it was cool. I also ran into a few crashes and softlocks that were thankfully very rare. Just when I completed a stage, I took damage and couldn't do anything to restart. The game crashed for some reason during a loading screen, and the game also crashed when I was playing on the Steam Deck. I have no footage of the last one unfortunately, but the game was running completely fine and it was on a new file too. Now I should also mention that the game has been patched while I've been working on this video, and some of the bugs might have been fixed. But even then, there were a fair amount of issues I still ran into even after the patches. That includes this odd dropout and this. The patches do make combo runs a bit more tolerable though, not by much, but at least I can ledge grab a bit more consistently. Still, there were definitely more glitches and oddities than I expected from the game, but it's a small enough issue where it probably won't affect most people. Even then, I still think that the game is overall a great time. The movement and level design work really well together, with a few power-ups and items to keep things from getting stale. The collectibles offer their own ways to test the player if they're looking for something extra, and the extremely demanding high scores are an amazing challenge for those who've mastered everything the game has to offer. And to top it all off, the music is just absolutely phenomenal. And you want to know why? There you go. T-Lopes is already well known for composing amazing tracks, but it's not just him on the game's OST. There's also Sean Bialo, sorry if I mispronounced that, who made some of the energetic tracks, and even Christian Whitehead helping with a handful of tracks too. Who knew he can make music, right? There's Hunter Bridges on the guitars, and Johnny Atma, known for his Gametal remixes, or is it Gametal, also helping with some guitars as well, which is really cool to see. All of the level themes are super appealing and distinct, always catching your ears as soon as you enter a new world. And for every main level theme, there's also a faster Pango mix if you got a penguin stuck onto you. Honestly, I wish we had a toggle or something to listen to these mixes whenever we wanted, because sometimes I prefer the faster tempo over the normal mixes. Maybe if we could use them in Time Attack, or with an optional toggle after beating the game. That'd be a nice feature to have, because you barely even hear them in game. Boss music is pretty solid as well, and cutscene music just kinda exists, but again, cutscenes don't really need much to work well, so they're alright. The only tracks that didn't leave much of an impression are the ones used for the Star Globes. It's mostly due to how short the stages are, so you can't really listen to one track for long. They're also not associated with any level theme or aesthetic, so they don't really leave a lasting impression either, but at the very least they work for smaller stages like these. Altogether, Penny's Big Breakaway is an amazing debut title for Evening Star. The game is a remarkably fun experience for both casual and expert players. The core gameplay works exceptionally well once you get used to your moves, and there's a fair amount of content to sink your teeth into, not to mention how replayable the game can be. The flashy and expressive visuals work well with a cartoon-like art style, and the music is full of fantastic tracks that I simply can't get enough of. There's a handful of issues for sure, with the okay boss fights and very small bits of jank, but everything else easily makes up for it. For $30, I think you're getting your money's worth, and if you're still on the fence, you can always wait for a sale to come around. There's probably going to be one during the summer anyways. The game's on all current gen consoles including PC and Switch. I've already said this earlier, but for those curious, the main difference for Switch is that it runs at a lower resolution and at 30 FPS, with an unlocked but unstable frame rate as an alternative option. And as I said before, other platforms can run at 120 FPS, so it's quite a jarring difference to go from 120 FPS down to 30, but if you're willing to put up with it, the Switch version is completely fine otherwise. If you're looking to play portably though, you can also play on the Steam Deck if you have it, as that version does run at 60, with slightly better visuals to boot. But that's all I have to cover. As for me, I'll be back in like 2 months when I finish my next video. What it'll be is kind of up in the air, but you'll find out eventually. You can like and subscribe if you want, or don't, that's up to you, and I'll see you later.